We are nearly ready to export our scene. But before we do, this is our last chance to refine our scene, tweak our sampling settings, and ensure we have a clean render to export. I've gone ahead and docked my render settings over my attributes window just so I have easier access and can see my render view and settings at the same time. Now, the first thing we want to do is to enable bucket mode. This is going to get us closer to our final render look in the render view itself. It is a little bit slower than progressive mode, but it definitely gives us a closer look to our final render. So we can see already that the center of my scene, where things are in focus, everything looks pretty okay right now. There's not a whole lot of noise there to mess with, but everything that has depth of field and blur over it is getting very, very noisy. So we need to go ahead and start cleaning that up before our final render. I'm going to hop over into my Redshift settings. The first thing I want to do is enable my global illumination engine. I'm going to go ahead and use brute force for both my primary and secondary engine. And I'm going to go ahead and start with a number of rays of 512. That's going to help clean up our volumes and our Redshift environment using the dome light. The next thing I want to do is start adjusting my camera rays or my unified samples. My samples min here is the minimum number of rays that the camera is going to send out per pixel. So right now it's set to 4. And the samples max is the maximum number of rays that Redshift will send out from the camera to try to clean up noise. That is set to 16, which is obviously not enough at this point. I'm going to go ahead and quadruple that to 64. And I'm going to double my samples min to 8 and see where we get. So already we're starting to smooth out, and you can see that right here in the middle where my bucket mode has started rendering. Out here towards the edges, my bucket mode hasn't quite gotten to yet. There's definitely still some noise in here, so I'm going to go ahead and double my samples max and double my samples min. That's getting a little bit cleaner, but let's go and double it one more time just for good measure. Another thing we can do to start adjusting blur and the noise that we see in it is to adjust our adaptive error threshold down. If I put in something like 0.005, we'll start to see that more of these pixels get cleaned up. And if I go even further down, like 0.002, it'll clean up a lot faster, but it will also take a little bit longer at render time. Now, we have a samples max of 256. For global illumination, it's typically best to use 4 times the amount of rays as your samples max. So at 256, we can just type in 256 times 4, and we get 1024. Now, I can already tell that there's still some noise happening in my Redshift environment volume back here, so I'm going to go ahead and double that number just to be safe. The last thing we want to talk about during sampling is sampling overrides. If I drop this down, sampling overrides just allow us to override individual light samples and individual material samples. We only have a single light in here, a dome light, and I believe it's already set to 512 samples if I look under the volume samples. I'm going to go ahead and override that and adjust it to 1024. That's going to help clean up our volumes and some of our reflections a little bit, as well as our shadows. I'm just going to go ahead and check override samples, and we're already at 1024 in here. And then lastly, I'm going to go ahead and override our reflections and our materials. I didn't really set the material samples as we built them, but I do know that there are quite a few reflections in this scene that could use some cleaning up. So if I override the samples, I want to make sure that all of these sampling overrides are at least double what my samples max are in the unified sampling. That was at 256, so this 512 is going to be just fine for us. As you spend time tweaking these settings, it's important to remember that there is a trade-off between getting clean renders and render times. Sometimes it's okay to settle for just a little bit of noise in your scene in order to keep your render times down. Right now, I'm feeling pretty confident with where I am. I may tweak this just a little bit more after this lesson.